Greg. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to our second lecture in our Tech Talk speaker series in partnership with Scott Labs Canada. My name, of course, is Barb Tatarnik, and I'm the Manager of Outreach for the Cool Climate Enology and Viticulture Institute here at Brock University. And we are pleased to partner with Scott Labs Canada to present this series of speakers focused on industry knowledge mobilization. Our collective hope is to connect researchers and subject matter experts with grape growers, winemakers, cider and perry producers, proprietors, and retailers. In mid-May, we hosted our first talk on kiwi grapes, a sustainable option for Ontario's future, which is now available on the Covey website under Outreach. Today's Tech Talk is being live streamed. If you're coming to us online, please enter your questions into the platform, and our communications officer, Greg Junop, will be managing the feed and making sure your questions get asked. Our talk today will be on cider production. The cider industry in Canada has experienced significant growth in recent years. It's a vibrant industry that continues to evolve, celebrating both tradition and innovation. Today's cider makers continue to look for methods to add to their collective toolkit to help advance and preserve taste, aromas, and mouthfeel produced during their cider fermentations. To build on that toolkit, it's my pleasure to introduce Sigrid Gersten-Schibbye, Area Manager in Enology for Lallemand in Scandinavia and the United Kingdom. Sigrid started fostering a passion for fermentation early in life. We're filling bottles for secondary fermentation in the basement of her family home in Montreal, Canada. After earning a degree in microbiology from McGill University, life has taken flight, working with Lallemand and living near Niagara Falls, California, and onwards to supporting the UK and Scandinavian markets, always guided by the need to speak about the wonderful world of microbes. Please join me in welcoming Sigrid for her presentation, Getting to the Core of Craft Cider Production, Techniques to Enhance and Maintain Flavors.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the good title, Steve. I thought we were very clever there. Give ourselves a pat on the back. So I love speaking about cider, and I've had the pleasure this week of visiting cideries in Quebec and Ontario, so I hope I can dial in a little bit to some of the tips that I've come up with or I've been made more aware of during the week, and can benefit the cider industry and anybody interested in cider studying apple fermentations. My name is Sigrid. As it was the introduction, I've had the pleasure of working with Lallemand since 2001, and through the different iterations and markets, I'm now very much a part of the UK cider industry. So it's been really interesting to see some of the different apples being used here, though I'm familiar with them, having eaten many of them growing up. But also just the different the goals and the products that are on the market, because the idea perhaps is one, but what is actually being produced is very different. And if any of I'm sure some of you follow some of the different people speaking about cider trends. Gabe Cook, the ciderologist, recently had a rant about the demise of bittersweet, or the interest in more culinary apples with a cider focus. So that's something that can be chatted about after, for those of you who are here, but that would be an interesting aspect. Today, I would like to focus on some of the microbiological tools, mainly focusing on developing and preserving the aromas that are in apples, and seeing how we can work with the apples we have regardless of what type of apple we have. See if I can get technology to work with me here. Maybe I'll just go back to a good old-fashioned. So yeah, getting to the core of craft cider. I think what I'll try and do is focus on craft cider. I think that's very relevant for the audience. Some of the experience we have is with some larger producers. So At a craft level, you're looking at 8% alcohol, perhaps 5% alcohol, or 3% alcohol. Some of the larger producers are looking at higher alcohol percentages, and some of our research is focused on how do we help the yeast get to these higher alcohol levels. We have a lot of experience with our yeast in a grape matrix. That's very different from an apple matrix, and what those differences are is really what we've been looking at in the last 5-10 years, because the profile is very different. So when we talk about nutrition, it's relevant to have some of the same concepts, but it's very different in terms of the actual application. So hopefully we can touch on some of those elements. So, cider. Where does it all come from, the microbiology? It's very much originating from the apples and from cider equipment. What you're using in the cidery has a lot of some of this wild population, and how that's coming out in your fermentations depends on what the goal is of the fermentations. The yeast that are there can be non-fermentative yeast, which is, I think, something that's become really relevant and really interesting, I think, in the last 5 years. Before, we would sort of say, well, there's the Saccharomyces, the one who does the fermentation, and then there's the other yeast. I think our knowledge of yeast production has changed a great deal, and what we're interested, or what is the market is looking for in terms of having non-Saccharomyces yeast, these other varietals are really interesting, these other species, sorry. And we'll touch a little bit on those in this presentation. And then the other organisms that are around are bacteria. And that's, I think, a whole other discussion, because the talk of malolactic or not malolactic or spontaneous fermentations in cider, and what are the organisms, the bacteria that are in the background, I think that's almost a presentation to itself, because it's very different. In wine, you're trying to reduce the malic, get some lactic, increase the pH. In apple, there is malic acid, so how much malic acid gets consumed, at what point does it inhibit the organism itself, because at some point there's a feedback loop. That's, I think, another topic. But we'll talk a little bit about malic acid on another level. So, here we are, Lallemand. It's all about yeast, but that's not quite true, because Lallemand also does other products. But if you look at the different yeasts that are in the fermentation process, we can see a lot of the relationships between these different yeast categories. So it's wine, it's beer, it's sparkling wine, it's cider, and we're looking at these different species and how they relate to each other. It's really interesting, because with the more modern methods of analysis, you can see how they relate to each other, but then also how they're different, how that environment of apples makes for a unique set of species that are relevant in an apple fermentation. So that's something we're able to look at and look at more specifically in the last couple of years. And it's beyond just the microbiology, which used to help us a great deal. You can see the apiculate yeasts, you can see some clecra, some pichia, but how that relates to an apple fermentation is perhaps not as well documented, and that's something we're looking into a great deal. Normally I would just launch into yeast fermentation and nutrients, but I thought it's relevant today is just to start from the beginning of a fermentation. What are those tools? And I'm hoping in the next smaller hour, at the end, you're not thinking, oh my gosh, that was way too much information. I hope you keep it in an element of a toolkit, as Barb mentioned, in the relevance of what could be relevant in my fermentation process. What would be something I might want to try? You're not necessarily all going to want to try one product or another, and you're not going to want to try 6 products. I'm not here to say I'd love it if you use them all, but there are some elements that are really interesting, and I'm hoping some of these different products are like, ooh, that's something I hadn't thought about. That could be very relevant in my process, because perhaps you're fermenting at 10 degrees Celsius, and that's very relevant for your cellar temperature. And then a product like this one I'm about to speak to. It could also be that you have a quick fermentation that's needed, and you need just a really simple yeast that does a lot of aromatic contribution. That's great. Or if you've had a lot of H2S, What can you do to avoid that? So that's what I'm hoping is there's going to be a few topics, a few ideas, and how that's relevant to you is what you're able to take up. This is an example of our, what we call level 2, and this is the non-Saccharomyces yeast I'm very excited to talk about because it's so relevant in cider. We have different level 2 yeast. There's the Initia, which is a Mechnicovia. I love saying the names, don't get distracted. There's also some level 2 products that, for example, will contribute some acid. So instead of adding malic acid before you're bottling, you could have a fermentation that's contributing some lactic acid and increasing that balance in the final product. These are the non-Saccharomyces, and those are the different ones. In this example, it's if you're doing, for example, you've got a juice that perhaps is waiting to start a fermentation, or you've got a long, slow buildup of the Saccharomyces, there's kind of that open space of wild fermentation. If you've tried it before but keep getting sort of acetic acid notes or sort of volatile acidity, then possibly the idea would be to have a population there that won't produce volatile acidity and will protect the juice, both on not oxidizing, but also in terms of preserving the aromas and in terms of avoiding that there's other populations that can grow. So if you look at this one, for example, you have an antimicrobial action. If you, for example, using this Hansenia spora as a contamination organism, and it's allowed to establish itself for 2 days. And then you're inoculating the level 2 Initia, and then you're inoculating the Saccharomyces at day 5. So it's this sort of population dynamics that's occurring. And what happens is if you inoculate here with the Mechnicovia, that's a non-fermentative organism, but clearly has an effect versus the population that didn't have non-Saccharomyces. So there's clearly an effect of this population inhibiting the Hansenia spora that's able to flourish quite a bit more before the Saccharomyces takes over. This would normally happen in a wild fermentation as well. So it's even if you're inoculating, or if that Saccharomyces is able to grow its biomass and start to kill these non-Saccharomyces by producing alcohol, then you can see there's quite an impact of that Hansenia spora that would occur. And what we can see happening here is, in this yeast population, you say at the start you only have 30% of the Hansenia spora, and then you see all these other yeasts clearly are about 70% of the other organisms that are present. If you have a control that we saw in the other one, by a few days later, 5 days later, at 10 degrees Celsius, so it's quite cold, still that Hansenia spora was able to jump up to 50% and diminish those other wild yeast that were there. If you're adding an organism that has this sort of control aspect of eliminating this organism that can contribute some off aromas, you can see it's completely overwhelmed, almost completely overwhelmed it. So it's interesting to see with a biocontrol, if you want to use that word, you're able to shift that population and have an organism that's able to dominate until the Saccharomyces are able to take over and continue the fermentation, the alcoholic fermentation. What's interesting about this, so just to give you an idea, it's what's called a Mechnicovia pulcherrima. We have some other Mechnicovias that have different goals in fermentation, in a pre-fermentation. Either it's in red wines, some of them are very specific for the Mechnicovias for developing aromas. So even if it's not a fermentative organism, it's helping to contribute to the overall aromas that are being produced. It's a natural solution, I think, in this day and age where we have, you're trying to decrease SO2, even for large companies, trying to decrease the SO2 for products going into cans. This is relevant as well, because instead of adding SO2, you can dominate the population with a non-Saccharomyces yeast. It protects against oxidation and spoilage organisms. So we've talked about the spoilage organism just here, but oxidation is also an important one as well. It has an oxygen consumption. It has the production of some compounds that need oxygen to produce these compounds. So this demand on oxygen is to produce some of these mouthfeel components. And that's a really good thing in terms of keeping some of the oxidation both on if you're avoiding SO2, it has that antimicrobial, because normally when you're talking about avoiding SO2, it's fine to have the antioxidant component, but a critical one is still to consider is this antimicrobial side. And it does this as well by dominating some of that aspect. So in this case, they gave the example of volatile thiols, because there was an example of a Sauvignon Blanc, but in general, it's preserving some of these aromas. If we continue on this idea of avoiding spoilage and oxidation, another aspect, another microbiological tool in the toolkit could be an inactive yeast. We tend to think of inactive yeast coming to play in the development of a product when it's sitting on its lees, for example. So post-fermentation, the lees are in the barrel or in a tank, and you're perhaps using these clean lees. As autolysis occurs, you get some sort of creamy components from that yeast autolyzing, and in the same token, there's a powerful antioxidant component of that lees. But if you think about what it is that's causing that antioxidant, it's often this component called GSH. It's glutathione, and when it's added early in the fermentation, you're really stopping that browning. And apples, as we know, are very known for browning. I think if anybody's ever eaten an apple or crushed an apple, it's a very quick reaction. So if you can come right from the beginning of the fermentation and block that pathway, and that's what this glutathione is able to do. The glutathione is a tripeptide, and it's a tripeptide that's produced by the yeast. So in looking in the Lallemand collection of yeast, we could see we have some of these strains that are really good at producing higher levels of glutathione. It helps when you have a whole library of yeast to look through. And those yeast can really be contributing a great deal to having the difference between a product that's quite oxidized versus one that's quite fresh. So just to give you an idea, this latest innovation in the product is called Glutastar, and as I was mentioning, this yeast derivative is called glutathione, and it's known as GSH. Sorry. It is certified organic, so again, it's helping in this sort of green label, in this idea of reducing SO2. This, compared to the level 2, the organism that's active and doing an active biomass population in the initia, this is an inactive yeast, so it's only contributing on the level of antioxidant. It's not contributing on an antimicrobial level. But all these small contributions add up at the end of the fermentation to have a product that's really much more fresh, and also fresher for longer because those aromas are preserved. So essentially it's coming in and blocking that quinone pathway that goes towards oxidation. I don't think we need to go into too much more. I did want to give an example. If we just flip back to this idea of antioxidant and the level 2 initia. So it's avoiding deviations, it's preserving varietal aromas, but just this was an example. One I wanted to show was if you had a product without SO2, in this example it was a Sauvignon Blanc, but I think it's relevant in a cider aspect. This was with adding SO2, a typical amount. I could find it. I don't think just a normal, probably 30 ppm or something along those lines. And this was an example of having the level 2 initia. So it's giving an idea of it really does have an impact on preserving that color through the early stages of the fermentation. And how can I resist? I'm Lallemand. We still need to get to talk about yeast a little bit. What are the yeast doing? Perhaps a little bit simplistic, but I think it's always good to come back to some of the remembering what's going on and what is the relevance in terms of when you're adding these different products. So we were looking before at pre-fermentation with these other products, and now if we're looking at what is the different phases, remembering there's a lag phase, and that's typically where you might have these non-Saccharomyces that are quite active while the Saccharomyces population is building up. The neat thing with craft cider is there's also some non-Saccharomyces yeast that are fermentative. And with cider being a less, the perfect modern product, being gluten-free, low alcohol, etc., we do have some of these non-Saccharomyces yeast that can take the fermentation in cider to completion at 5%. But even if you're doing a higher alcohol product of 8%, 10% alcohol is about the maximum. So there are some interesting non-Saccharomyces that can do a fermentation as well. But in the meantime, we've got this yeast adapting to the environment, and then in this exponential phase, and this will be relevant in a moment when we talk about some of the nutrition, the yeast is very much focused on the energy production and building that biomass, and there's a great deal of activity going on that doesn't seem very active when you're looking at it, but there's a great deal happening in terms of building that biomass and getting the cells ready to come up into this stationary phase. And you think, okay, they made it to the stationary phase, we're all good. But that's actually probably the most difficult part for the yeast, because there's, at this point, very few nutrients left. They've utilized them here in the exponential phase. But at the same time, there's still quite a bit of sugar at the same time as the alcohol is starting to be produced. So those cell membranes really need to be quite fit to be able to resist all the different aspects that are starting to work against the yeast in terms of a toxicity level. So it seems very simple to say, well, it's made it to the stationary phase, all it's got to do now is ferment and die. But there's a lot to consider if you were a yeast. We're people, we still have to consider this same element of nutrition. And that has changed a lot, as it has in human nutrition, if you look through the years, of how we manage yeast. Having been part of this, it's very relevant to see how we've changed our story at Lallemand and how we've presented it. But certainly in the 1990s, getting into the 2000s, a great deal of the focus of yeast fermentation, and it was funny, I was just looking at some presentations from the 2000s and 2010s. We felt we were on the cutting edge of things, and now it's like, this is ancient history. It's very strange. So initially we were just thinking, okay, DAP, the yeast need yan, they're going through this exponential phase, and they're building that population, all they need is nitrogen. And then in the 2000s, we're like, okay, first of all, there was this sort of shift in mentality that some clients wanted organic. So we had an organic nutrient that came on the market. And customers came back saying, we actually prefer the fermentation with organic nutrition. It wasn't as fast, as hot, so we didn't have to cool the fermentations, and the aromas were a lot better. So this whole sort of tied in with, what's that saying about the fermentations? They were still able to finish, even if the amount of nitrogen in terms of a number was a lot less, but the quality of the fermentation ended up being better. So we're looking at the quality of the nitrogen, organic nitrogen coming from organic nitrogen sources, often yeast, and inorganic nitrogen in terms of ammonia or ammonium. And then we get into this even more, it's not just about nitrogen anymore. We're getting into this well-balanced nutrition. So even if there was lots of nutrients, nitrogen, there's still stuck fermentations. Why is that? So looking at vitamins, minerals, the lipids, at the same time as this is going on, we're looking at rehydration protectors, giving that yeast the sort of super person cape on to be able to get to the end of the fermentation. And realizing that some of the additions or the focus on having a yeast that's not just viable, but is vital, so a yeast that's not just alive, but a yeast that really has an impact on the aromatic development, that's finishing the fermentation cleanly, not just kind of trickling to the end, that had an impact if you were adding it at the beginning. So vitamins and minerals that were added at the beginning were actually having a tremendous impact on the end of fermentation, and all the way through, of course. But that connection meant that we weren't just looking at feeding the fermentation in the exponential phase, it was looking at that whole fermentation as a balanced whole. And that's ended up in these last few years of looking at almost individual nutrition for different either grape varietals or apples, etc. We still need to come up with a stimulant for cider, but you guys can help me get that through into our system. But it looks at what it is in that varietal that is needed to make certain aromas. So being both a yeast producer, but also understanding yeast nutrition and being the producer of the nutrients means that we can look at that from a whole. We're not just sort of picking up products and saying, here's great yeast. We're looking at, okay, well, there's a yeast, and there's the grape, or here's the apple must. What do those two need to be able to do together? Is it some of these enriched vitamins. Is it zinc to produce certain aromas? Is it magnesium or manganese? It's getting to such a level that we're understanding much more what's going on in the yeast and what is needed to make a better product. So it isn't just about sugar and nitrogen, adding a little bit of oxygen. It's these elements, there's a spelling mistake, that are really important in that whole, and that's balanced. So if we're looking at low nitrogen, actually I think this one's been shown so many times, but okay, we'll give an example. If we're looking at some of these kinetics that we're looking at, if there's really low nitrogen, I'll bring it up because it's relevant in a moment. This is 60 parts per million of yeast available nitrogen. This one's 140, and here we have 300. It's not always as relevant. This is, for example, I think we're still looking at it in terms of a grape must. It's a little bit different if you don't have to go to 16% alcohol, if you only have to go to 8% alcohol. But there is still a point where too little nitrogen is too low. The yeast do need a minimum, and what is that minimum will also depend on the pH, the temperature, the microbial load, etc. So these are all still relevant. Perhaps the numbers will change over the years as we figure out what is the best nitrogen levels for apples. But that's also different in the apple world, is that we also have fresh juice. We have fresh juice that's pasteurized, so there's different nutrient levels there. We have concentrate that's been pasteurized, concentrated, and packed away and stored for many months. So even if I'm talking about apple must, it's a little bit more complicated than it is actually in grapes, because am I relevant to everybody in the room if I'm talking about apple must? The goal, the dream is everybody's making apple cider with fresh juice, but that's not always the case in the industry. Definitely not always the case. And there's also sometimes where, yes, there's fresh juice, but in an industrial product there's added glucose or fructose. And what does that mean for the yeast as well? So yeah, just to give an idea of some of these different elements of numbers, I think I'm going to assume if there's been an awareness of a basic course before here, we can see that what is yeast available nitrogen. Yeast available nitrogen is this ammonia component, inorganic, and the free amino. And what we're seeing is that sometimes in grapes there's a certain amount of ammonia available, whereas in apples sometimes that is extremely low. And we've looked at some different apple juice aminograms, looking at each individual amino acid, and seeing how different that is from grapes. So in grapes, there's quite a variety of amino acids that are available to the yeast. In apples, it becomes very limited. And that is a factor not only in terms of yeast health and vitality, but also in terms of development of aromas. So there's aromas that are linked to sugars and the amino acids as precursors. So it becomes very relevant to look at some of this, even if it seems a little overwhelming just here and now. If we look at some of these different YANs, the yeast available nitrogen, we can see in hybrid grape varietals, in different Labrusca and rotundifolia, as well as the Vitis vinifera, looking at levels that, well, it really depends. Some of them are quite high and would be okay for a 12 or 14% alcohol fermentation. But apples, on a general whole, I mean, this is there are some statistical, it's relevant, it seems general, but they're on the whole, it's quite low. So it's really relevant to keep that in mind when we're looking at some form of supplementation, hopefully mostly organic. If we look at a survey of Virginia-grown apples, you can see, yeah, there's a few perhaps that are quite high and creep above 100, but on the general, you're looking below 100 for the majority of them. And that's quite actually, it's a really good, a good sort of overview of some of the apples that are used, especially on the East Coast, that are relevant. This is a few years ago, but still, if we look back at what was traditionally seen as a minimum of sort of 140, 150 parts per million of yan, that number may shift as we get more awareness of what apples need in fresh apple juice. But certainly if we look at just the percentage, 95% of them are below that 140, which we've traditionally seen as a minimum amount. It's quite low. Any questions up until now? I'm sort of racing along. No? Good. Cool. as I mentioned there, it's predominantly amino acids that are available in apples. And there's so many other factors, but that's the same as in grapes. If we were to sort of try and relate some of our current knowledge and the vast majority of research that's done in the world being on grapes and being on this topic, there's the same as in a grape vineyard management, the orchard management when it relates to apples. The crop loads are tremendously different and much, perhaps, not as regulated as they are in grapes. The cultivar, as we saw on the previous slide, in terms of which type of apples, and also juice clarification. Some people use enzymes, some are very clear, some are less clear. But we definitely are seeing an impact on nutrition. The yeast have different needs as well. I think that's probably something that is very relevant, and in many of these handbooks you can see what is the yeast levels that's either generally categorized as low, medium, and high. But it's just to be aware of, yes, we're looking at the apple must and seeing what is there, but we're also looking at which, if you are choosing a yeast, that it's relevant to perhaps those lower ones. So perhaps not choosing a yeast that is in that upper category of high demand of different yeast available nitrogen, and perhaps looking at sort of the yeast that have a lower demand to be able to be healthy and vital throughout the fermentation. This is a specific example in cider where we were looking at some different complex yeast nutrients that have a mix of organic and inorganic, as well as completely organic nitrogen and inorganic nitrogen as the DAP. And you can see that certainly a complex nutrient does have an advantage in an apple juice, in an apple must, compared to just DAP. So it's sort of emphasizing this aspect that organic nitrogen and more complex nitrogen has a relevance in the sense that it's not just about how much nitrogen is added. If we were to give an example, look at an example, it's getting a little bit long in the tooth, but it's still very relevant just in terms of numbers. If you look at a DAP adding 50 parts per million, which is quite high, versus an organic nutrition addition of 24. So we've done some experiments where we only added, say, 16 parts per million of DAP, and then the organic nutrient was about 16 to 18 parts per million. The fermentation speed isn't that different. So it shows that the impact of an organic nutrient is almost double, if not 1.5 times, as relevant to a yeast fermentation compared to purely inorganic nitrogen. So it's not necessarily, even if we know that in our minds the amount of DAP or nitrogen is related to the Vmax, the speed of the fermentation, it's also relevant to look at that organic nitrogen contribution. And what's most interesting, if it's not just about speed, is this organic nitrogen contribution to the aromas. A clear impact on the aromas when this is more acetic and nail lacquer, and then looking more at tropical floral fruit esters. So that shift, even if it was almost half of the number in terms of organic nitrogen versus inorganic nitrogen, there is an impact on the aroma as well. So if I have one message, it's not just about nitrogen, but it's also about that balance between lipids, vitamins, and minerals, giving these aromas the yeast health, vitality, as well as performance and other aspects, enzyme activity relating to development of aromas. So if we're looking at vitamins, we know vitamins. We've seen them all on the shelves growing up. I don't need to go into what those are, but just looking at how important they are in terms of not necessarily being able to be synthesized by the yeast. Sometimes an organism can synthesize what it needs for a fermentation, but that's not always relevant for these vitamins. So when they're depleted, there really isn't any way for the yeast to get more of them. So having something either as a protector from the beginning of the fermentation or having an addition through an organic nutrient is very relevant. And I think especially we see, as we've seen in the last three slides, is this importance as enzyme cofactors, being able to turn on the enzymes that are relevant to healthy fermentation and aroma development. H2S comes up a great deal in terms of cider fermentations. And so I was going to just bring this one up as an example of the pantothenic acid. If a yeast has a great deal of nitrogen available to it, if, for example, you're just tossing in the DAP because that's the cheapest way to do it and it's got to go quick, and the turnaround, it's got to get in the can in 5 days, that imbalance that can occur if you have low pantothenic acid can be seen in these yeast populations. So this is a viable cell count over here. And looking, if it's low YAN, it's going to be a slow ferment. You're not going to get that product into cans anytime soon because it is lower yeast available nitrogen. The fermentation is going to be long and drawn out. But you don't see the population crashing. What does happen if you have a low pantothenic acid and it gets eaten, but you have supplemented with, say, DAP, so you have a high YAN, we still see that population crashing because there's an imbalance between the yeast going, I've got nitrogen, I'm going to ferment, but it doesn't have the necessary vitamin, in this case, as pantothenic acid. And it's accentuated as if you have a high yeast available nitrogen, the production of H2S, this is total H2S evolved. So at low levels of pantothenic acid, but high levels of yeast available nitrogen, you really have spikes in the H2S. And sometimes that only becomes more relevant at the end of the fermentation because you see that H2S developing as the yeast are dying or autolyzing. And that's sometimes that the feedback is the fermentation went fine, but there was a lot of H2S at the end of the fermentation. So it might be worthwhile looking at what's going on in terms of nutrient supplementation and how that would be relevant. The reason behind this is that if the yeast has a fair amount of nitrogen, if it has low nitrogen, it has a stress response. And it says, okay, there's not enough nitrogen, I'm going to adapt to this environment, and I'm going to adapt to a lower nitrogen and go more slowly. What happens is, if there's a depleted amount of nitrogen, and they're micronutrient-starved cells, there's also a relevant in terms of adaptation to the environment. But what happens is, if there's a high amount of amino acids, the yeast doesn't have that stress response. So it's going ahead as if there was an ample amount of everything that's following along in the baggage of vitamins and minerals. And that stress response then involves that the yeast isn't adapting, and that vitality decreases and results in cell death. So it just helps to realize that the yeast is trying to adapt to its environment, but it doesn't always have the time to adapt to some of the other elements. So we saw pantothenic acid before, but if you look at all of it, it's different perhaps in how important it is, but many of those vitamins will have an impact on how quickly the yeast cell will have a stress response and decrease its cell vitality. So organic nutrition can prevent this, both in terms of the rehydration protection and also in terms of an organic contribution. And it doesn't have to be huge. I'm not here to say you need to add a lot, but a little goes a long way, especially in the cider. We're going to touch on a little bit on malic acid and then one last topic, and then that'll be my contribution for a tech talk in terms of some of these biological tools. If we're looking at malic acid, especially in acid-driven apples that are quite predominant here in Canada and also on the eastern side of the continent, it's not necessarily, I'd hate to recommend adding a chemical, or let's say it would be better to use biological methods. There are some chemical ways, but I find there's always a sensory contribution that happens when there is a deacidification done chemically. So we could do malolactic bacteria. I think that's a whole other topic and needs some more experimentation in cider because it has a completely different balance. But some way we could decrease the acidity of malic acid would be by using some of the yeast that are actually doing a malloethanol conversion. So it's not malolactic, which means you don't necessarily, if there's a lot of malic converted to a lot of lactic, you get less of these yogurt aromas, the sort of lactic-y contribution. But by using some of the strains that actually do this malloethanol contribution, you can see that you can decrease quite a bit the malic acid. And it depends on how much malic there is and the temperature, etc. But two of the strains that do decrease a fair amount are Lalvin C and Lalvin 71. But Lalvin 71 is well known for many years. But it has a sort of a particular sensory contribution that might not be as relevant to an apple product. It's very tropical, etc. That can be. But the Lalvin C, if you're looking for a more neutral contribution, would be one to consider. It's used a great deal in the UK, and it's one of those strains. The more we come back to it and see what it's able to, it's phenomenal. It does really well in cider conditions. I was going to take this one out, but it's just more, it relates to the next one, is that in terms of aroma contribution. So these are some of the non-Saccharomyces. I don't think this trial didn't do justice to these non-Saccharomyces strains. But looking at some of these different Cerevisiae strains, if I were to show some of the aroma contributions, just showing how some of these different yeast can have a tremendous impact on the different aromas. And so if we look at some of the apple, tropical, red fruit, citrus, and floral aromas, seeing how some of these different yeast are contributing on a sensorial level, it still needs, this is in northern France, so how relevant these strains are, but we are seeing some, the more we're doing some trials, there are some strains that are really standing out for cider apples that are sort of more acid-driven. The OK had performed really well in a Norwegian experiment recently, so similar apple profiles, really good contribution. And yeah, it would be relevant. I think the one I use for my own cider, it's like 40 liters a year, is the Biodiva. I love the contribution. It's a non-Saccharomyces. She does ferment to the end, as opposed to the graph before. It just contributes this mouthfeel because it's a non-Saccharomyces that's really rich, and also these sort of cider aromatics, the sort of spicy apple spice notes, like a cooked or an apple pie, a fresh apple pie, not a cooked, not the cooked notes. But I really like that strain. So things to consider. But if you look at these sort of fantastic modern extrapolations, you can see how different they are, and it's modeling how these different aromas are from the strains that we saw before. But it's quite amazing to see how those different impacts are there. But if you're not looking at your nutrition, etc., you're not necessarily going to see those differences. So just to relate it back a little bit. The last one I wanted to talk about in terms of the toolkit was some newer products that are non-allergenic. So traditionally when we've recommended chitin products that are quite effective in an antimicrobial, for example, if you've just come into an apple must that's perhaps a little high in how many CFUs of wild stuff are going on, one way to knock some of those back without using SO2, coming back to the beginning of the presentation where we talked about reducing SO2 levels, would be these chitin products. They're derived from Aspergillus niger, which is a non-allergenic way to get the chitin products. The chitin is used in lots of things. It's not just fermentation, it's also in cosmetics, etc. It's quite a relevant product in many industries. But in this level, you could see the decrease before treatment versus 10 days after treatment. So chitin has a way of settling things out, but as it's settling things out, it's pulling these these populations, especially, for example, of acetic acid populations, down with it, and it disrupts the cell membrane. So although we recommend racking off it, because one little organism that's trapped under a bunch of other organisms that didn't get affected can start to regrow, but there's a tremendous decrease in population. So if you have a medium level of contamination, you can drop it almost down to zero. If you have a high level, you can drop it lower. All in all, it means that you can add less SO2, or if you are adding SO2, that it's much more relevant to protecting your must. So that's just an example of some of these newer products that can be relevant, and that could be like a Bactiless product, for example. So in conclusion, we talked a little bit about fermentations, non-Saccharomyces yeast, how they can help to protect the apple must and contribute to long-term aroma increases in that sort of overall pool of aromas that you're trying to do. Yeast nutrition, always a fun topic for me. I can talk all day about it. Oxidation protections, I think it's really relevant to look at. I think we look at apple as, okay, we'll just add yeast and we're all good to go. But I think if we have a little bit more focus on protecting the aromas from the beginning, I think you'll see that sometimes these more simple acid-driven apple varietals can have a better aromatic contribution and not be so simple, both with the yeast choice, but also in terms of some of these inactive yeast products that are so relevant when added at the beginning of the fermentation. And then managing spoilage with some of the chitosan products to help us have a beautiful cider that doesn't have any off deviations. So that, I hope, gives you some insights into some of the microbiological products that can contribute to a fantastic cider. Cool, that was it for me. Are there any questions? Okay.
I'm just going to moderate the Q&A.
Yes,
so I just need to speak into
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that one.
Hello, everyone. So my name is Jennifer Kelly. I work here as the enologist in Covey, and I'm here to moderate the question and answer period. So I'll just be sticking to this part of the podium. Thank you. I don't mean to like push you into the corner. So thank you so much for your incredible talk on cider production. I know it's a blossoming industry here in Ontario, so I'm sure we have questions perhaps from our audience here or online. So maybe we'll start with anybody in the room if there's any questions that we may have. Oh, there's one.
I've got lots, but I'm going to move my top one. I know that a lot of producers are starting to try new innovations with some pre-fermentation maturation of the mash.
Yeah.
Mainly for flavor development, not necessarily going the full cubes with it, but just to let it hang out a little bit more on skins and seeds before fermentation. And I wonder if you might want to talk about how some of these products, especially non-Saccharomyces yeast or maybe even other thiolate-containing products, might be helpful for producers who are trying to innovate that way in terms of trying to increase the aromatic profile of their ciders.
Okay, I just have to repeat the question. So the question is, some producers are finding that a pre-fermentation mash is a method that they're using to preserve volatiles in the final product. If there's any recommendations for that kind of method, and if there's any products that you might recommend? Okay, yes, that's the question.
Yeah, I think it's the same, it's that aspect of the more you look at what is there of aromatics and organisms that are there, it's always a bit of a risk. It's a huge risk, but it can be a managed risk. So I would say, because I think you've got it's the same idea of having a spontaneous or a natural wine versus a spontaneous and a natural cider. Is it an apple cider that you want to make that is true to the area, of a more representative of the area, versus a cider that's more a style of cider that you want to make? So with having products that help to mitigate the risk, I think you're contributing to letting the apple speak more truly of where that apple has grown in terms of orchard and sunlight and soil, if you're managing the risk. Because if you let that maceration or that sort of pre-fermentation maceration do its own thing, I think with the right experience, I'm not against a spontaneous, it's just that you need the experience to know that you have a good organism, a good population there, because typically I've seen, even with winemakers, is if they do a maceration, well, they stop it when the acetic acid is noticeable. But that becomes a fault on the big picture if it becomes too much. But in the right hands, it can be a winner. But it's either you're making vinegar or you're making a cider that is beautifully aromatic expressive. So I think it's very relevant with some of these products is if you're just building up to produce and sell and make a profitable business, then you're ensuring that that's possible and that clients will come back every time. I've tasted some in Denmark, these spontaneous fermentations. Yeah, there's some good ones. But there's ones I will never buy again. They're ever. It's a turn off. And yes, it sounds great and the label's good and it's funky and everything, but the apple cider is funky too. So I think if you're building up and building experience, these products can help you see, okay, that's one this is my goal. This is what I want to get to. Let's do it safely and have a product to sell to build my business versus taking too many risks too early. Yeah. So that would be my first contribution to that question.
Anyone else in the room with any questions?
Because otherwise Steve's got it.
I'll anyway, but I'll let some online.
Okay, nothing on that? Okay, so far.
I have another question.
Oh, wow.
Is it, which product would make more sense, a non-Saccharomyces, if you have to transport pressed juice from one location to another? Or would it be the glutathione, which would be the better choice in order to protect it from obviously oxidative impact?
So the question is, what's the recommendation for transferring pressed juice?
Yeah, I think it's very relevant because it seems like here, especially in Ontario, but also in other provinces, sometimes the orchards are a distance away or have to be stored, etc. So after being crushed and getting to the cider producer is very relevant. I think if I have to emphasize in terms of cost investment, I would say the non-Saccharomyces yeast, non-fermentative yeast would be the best investment in a transport, because that is the one that's going to not only contribute on protecting from oxidation, but also have an antimicrobial activity in that transport, whether the transport is 2 hours or it's a hot summer day and it takes 2 hours at 35 degrees Celsius, or even if it's a cooler day but it gets stuck or it has to transport 8 hours. It just allows those organisms to be the dominant ones, and then the Glutastar would be sort of a product it's a nice to have versus a need to have. So if I was going to make an investment, I would say a non-Saccharomyces would be the best investment for a transport.
Marissa?
Is there anything in your toolkit that you'd suggest changing for producers that tend to concentrate down, put in storage, and do batch by batch fermentations versus people that are pressing and fermenting fresh juice, which is what everybody in BC does?
So the question is, it seems to be common practice in BC that apples are stored and then...
Not the apples, they get concentrated down into a concentrate that gets hydration added back and then fermented batch by batch by batch.
Okay.
In a lot of circumstances, is there anything about the toolkit that would change for people that are doing that?
Okay, so juice is concentrated, stored, and then utilized as needed. So any recommendations for that kind of...
How much are they concentrating? Do you have like a bricks or just...
20 bricks.
Oh, right, so that's actually not that it's concentrated, it's better than low. To come back to the non-Saccharomyces, just because it's popping into my mind in terms of temperature, if you're looking at these temperatures of 0 to 4, the Mechnicovia are still active at those cooler temperatures. So normally you think of macerations at sort of 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, but we've done trials and it is active, and of course it's slower at 0 to 4 degrees. So that would still be a relevant option in terms of preserving, and it's because it's that cold and that sort of 4 degrees Celsius fridge temperature, I'm imagining, it's very relevant because it's there, it's slow, it's dominating the population and avoiding other organisms, especially the bacteria. Another one could be these chitosan products, because they're there and they would bring that population load very low, but it wouldn't have all the other benefits. But certainly in terms of keeping a freshness to that juice, I think that's either of those products would be good. I think what's typically done is SO2, I would imagine.
Mostly they just concentrate it to the point where the acid is so high that like nothing really wants to be in there, and they keep it in the coldest conditions they possibly can.
Yeah.
But it's more a space-driven decision than anything.
And
they don't process things. Most people, there's definitely people that do. Most people that have product needs all year long,
Yeah.
they concentrate and then they make batches as they go.
Yeah, yeah. That's, I mean, in terms of, for some larger producers, it's concentrate, but it's 70 bricks concentrate, so that's very relevant. But that, I mean, that one would have 0. I think for that level, I think it's that aspect of because it's juice, because it's still fresh juice, even if it's concentrated, there's still an element of oxidation going on. So I think there's several levels that could be looked at in terms of. But I think it would be fun, is if there's no one against it, it would be to do a trial of having different products. Yeah, I mean, that would be the neatest part, is to see which of these biological tools would be relevant in that case, because it's different from a 70 bricks concentrate, and it's also a different puppy compared to a single strength juice. and what is best over 1 month or 3 months, I don't have the exact answer, but there would be certainly a potential to do a trial, because none of those products would be a negative. It would just be a matter of, is it worth the investment, and how much better is it possibly? So yeah, that would be really interesting if there's anybody who's interested in doing a trial, and that would be relevant for a lot of people, I think. Yep.
For the level 2 product you mentioned, one of the benefits that it will reduce copper. How much copper do you have you?
Ooh,
How much is it like?
I don't have.
2%?
Yeah.
So the question is about one of the products that was mentioned during the presentation, that it reduces copper. So the question is, what are the initial copper levels?
Yeah, like how much can you decrease?
And how much can it be decreased? Yeah.
I don't have a number offhand. I did look at it before the presentation, but I could pull that up after. But Matthias, do you remember?
I can say something to it from the practical side of the winemaking side of things.
Matthias?
So,
Come over here.
Come on out.
so I wasn't planning to speak. So I can say something from the winemaking side of things here. In winemaking, people, when they deal with really extreme H2S productions during fermentation, they actually add copper, even during ferment, which we don't really want, but some people do, especially larger companies. And they actually figured out after fermentation, when everything is said and done, they have nothing. They have no dissolved copper in the product left. So that is basically how much the yeast tracks basically certain things down. Now, if you're talking about in juice and you want to reduce it in juice, you can add some kind of yeast-derived products, which can yeast hulls or this kind of products which you can add in order to settle it out. It will bind it, but how much would be left, I don't know, but you can diminish the amount quite dramatically.
But when I got the slide, I'll bring up, because we do have some trials that show specifically for the level 2 initia. There are several level 2 products, different Mechnicovias. But I'll get you a number, I'll follow up as a follow-up notes to give you a more relevant number. I don't have that one offhand. Question or a comment?
A question.
Okay.
So if you would have to do a cider, what kind of stimulant products would you suggest that we start to use? Or what would you use?
For cider production, what would be used as a stimulant?
The stimulant products as a nutrient?
Yeah.
What would you use?
Okay, so in the 40 liters that you make, what would you use as a stimulant?
Shaking up world production, my recommendation, no. The family has grown quite a bit, so it would be to look at more relevantly with the R&D team as to what is specific. I think traditionally we've looked at esters being a sort of a focus in cider production, and that would tend to be sort of the ester contribution of at 1/3 of the sugar depletion, the stimula Chardonnay. But I do have clients that have done sort of full-on thiol-boosting ciders and love that either as a full separate style or a blending tool, because it just pops it through. So the Glutastar combined with the Stimula Sauvignon or the Sauvignon, but they've also used the Sauvy yeast. So going full on, they've produced a really interesting one, because there are some of those precursors that get developed. But I think for my own cider, that's sort of more of a field blend. I would go much more towards an ester, because I prefer that style. But
we have obviously different amounts of potential biolic productions in the different apple varieties.
it's completely different than the Sauvignon. But I think I was surprised when a client said, I did a Sauvy yeast fermentation and loved it, because there is different apples have different thiolic precursors. Yeah. Not on the level of a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, but it makes for an interesting style. So, yeah, but personally, in my 40 liters.
I had a question about orchard management to increase nitrogen availability in apples. Would you have any recommendations on what can be done in the field?
Yeah, that's a good question, because many orchards, at least the ones I work in the UK, some of the more traditional orchards don't do any supplementations, but then, and that means that the apple must is very low in nitrogen, and so there's that whole conversation. In terms of increasing, I think that becomes much more of an orchard issue with some of the same issues that are in a vineyard. Really pushing me for an answer. We do have some sprays that are inactive yeast sprays that could increase some of the amino acid content, and those are inactive yeast products that help to stimulate the aroma precursors. So, but we haven't done a lot of trials on those, so I don't have a lot of. But I don't think, in terms of your question and direct supplementation, I think it's much more relevant to look at soil health, et cetera, and that's not as much something we focused on yet.
Yeah, and that's site-specific, vineyard-specific, regional, like there's so many.
There's so many factors in that as well, in terms of soil, et cetera. So I think that would be much more a soil health, which I think is also relevant with mycorrhizal aspects, and that's another division of Lalamont, it's plant care. So they might have some more relevant answers to that question, but it's a great question, because I think a lot of orchards are very low. I mean, it's because it's a 30-year, 50-year, 100-year plan with an orchard compared to a vineyard. I think it's very relevant to look at how we can help on an organic level supplement those, help the trees be healthier.
Do we have any other questions from the audience?
For those of you who are here, I have a cider, so those of you that didn't decide to drive to Brock University aren't going to get to taste, but so stick around if you have five minutes.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming today and for speaking. We don't have a new tech talk in the books just yet, but as soon as we do, we'll be sure to let everybody know so that they can join us either in person or online. So thank you so much for joining us today.